All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Here we are with lesson 9 in U.S. history, and this week we're going to be stepping out of the book a little bit and talking specifically about slavery in the United States and the southern states prior to the Civil War. And, you know, if there is a history, an ugly part of the history of the United States, it certainly is in dealing with race in our country, and slavery is the root of that. So it's important for us to talk a little bit about slavery, how slavery came to be, why slavery was so entrenched in the Southern mentality and economy, and why we had to go to war to try to rid ourselves of this evil. So let's take a look first and see who was it that actually owned slaves. We certainly know that the majority of slaves were in the South, and we have an image, at least from movies and from history, that most slaves worked on huge plantations, and that is actually true. The average Southerner really did not own slaves. The average Southerner was a yeoman farmer, a fairly poor farmer who maybe owned or rented their land, and most slave owners belonged to this class. However, they didn't own most of the slaves. So a yeoman farmer might have owned only as many as 10 slaves and usually worked right with them. So they needed the extra labor, the slave labor, to harvest the crop, but worked alongside as well, so did not necessarily live in the big manor house. And about 75% of all Southerners had no slaves at all. So the vast majority, 3/4 of the people in the South prior to the Civil War, did not own a slave. And we can kind of see this if we look at this particular graphic. You can see that about 76% were non-slave owners, 17.2% owned 1 to 9 slaves, about 6.6% owned 10 to 99 slaves, and only a tiny fraction, 1/10 of 1%, actually owned more than 100 slaves. So the large plantation, the large single owner owning lots and lots of slaves, was not the norm in the South. So how did human beings, white human beings in the United States, justify owning other human beings? What did they use to try to make their conscience clear and justify the fact that they could still be good people, God-fearing people, and own other human beings? Well, they used multiple justifications. One was biblical. There is a story in the Old Testament about Ham, and that there was a curse on Ham, and Ham was black, and therefore he was a less mortal than were other people in the Bible. There was historical justification. All great civilizations in the past had participated in slavery, certainly the Greeks and the Romans, and right on through time. There was a legal justification. The U.S. Constitution moved across and didn't deal with slaves. It was an issue that they kind of pushed across for later on, as we've talked about before. There was scientific justification. There were a number of different theories regarding the inferiority of black race. Of course, these were absolutely untrue, but they were used to have a scientific basis for considering African Americans to be not as superior or not as equal to whites. And then there was the sociological justification, and that was that the black race needed guidance by the white race. So what happened if you were a slave? What was your life like? Well, an average slave worked about 14 hours per day during the warm weather months, and about 10 hours in the winter. So that's a pretty hard, if we think about 8 hours being kind of a common number of hours we work these days, you can imagine 10 to 14 hours. And this was pretty rough work. This was hard, back-breaking work for the most part. They worked in groups of about 20 to 25 slaves, and those were all overseen by the slave driver. The task system allowed slaves to finish a designated task at their own pace, and a normal slave was expected to pick about 130 to 150 pounds of cotton per day. So they were expected to bring in approximately their weight or a little bit less in cotton every single day. Let's take a look a little bit about slave law and the family. The legal status of slaves in the South really wasn't dealt with too much, and there was a wide range of laws throughout the different states dealing with how African Americans, how slaves could be treated. These varied from fairly humane to pretty brutal. Marriages between slaves were often either not looked at as legal by whites or were arranged by whites so that they could have optimum genetic reproduction. So the strongest female and the strongest male were allowed to marry so that their offspring would be strong. Slave families were oftentimes separated, so a wife and her husband and the children often would be sold to different places over the course of their lifetimes, never seeing each other again. One of the things that held the African American, the slave populations together, was a strong belief in Christianity. The Christian ideals had been given to the slaves as they came over from Africa, where they had their own religions, and built into the fabric of their life. And they really used those to try to help them get through this horrific life that they were leading as slaves. So Christian worship was a critical part of life in the slave quarters, for sure. Black Christianity was included, also pulled in, the black Christianity pulled in elements of Islamic and African religions, so some of the things that they had back in Africa were continually used. Black gatherings were usually forbidden unless there was a white person there to make sure that they were not talking about sedition or issues that would lead for them overthrowing their white overseers. For the white planters, religion became a type of social control as well. They could use that religion, use that Christianity, to bend the slaves the way they wanted them to. The family dynamic was critical, and even though that family was broken up oftentimes, larger groups of slaves would get together and kind of form their own family, and that relationship was the central piece that protected and held them together. So slaves could draw that love, the support, and the cultural identity from these larger extended families. And they often performed extra work to provide extra food and clothing for their family. So sometimes they would do something extra beyond their 10 to 14-hour days in order to bring something else into the home. Now, this was a brutal time in American history, but not all slaves went through this without trying to protest in some way. And there was there was kind of a spectrum of protests, from rather mild to rather severe. And some of the ways that occurred were some of the mild ways. Anyway, were some acts of resistance that might include things like the breaking of tools, burning down houses or sheds, or crops, stealing food, hurting oneself so you couldn't work, or even work slow down. So trying to grind the labor to a halt in some way. Slaves also oftentimes might fake sickness to get out of work for a day or multiple days. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there were slaves who would go as far as murdering the white overseers or even the white owners, or running away and trying to flee to the north or flee to Canada. So that's a little information about how slavery worked in the United States prior to the Civil War. Your reading this time is going to go through this in more detail, and then you're going to also take a look at a couple of individual writings from slaves, some narratives from slaves, and get a better idea of this really important and rather ugly part of American history.